it gives you a sense of embodied presence to be able to kind of interact with things, believing that this world is real and plausible. It just makes it feel like you're actually there and doing things. And the place illusion is just that you actually feel like you're in another place. So those are kind of like the foundation stones of presence.
It's deja vu for us old people. They're the young kids in their VR. It's true.
Well,
and rolling.
Hello, my name is Kent Bai of the Voices of VR podcast, and you are listening to the Drax Files Radio Hour with Joe Yardley.
Hello there and welcome to the Drax Files Radio without Joe Yardley today. I apologize, Joe is not with us, and until a certain gigantic deadline in my day job is met, we will have no regular programs with all the little goodies, the origin stories. I have tons of raw, unedited origin stories. Thank you, Second Life residents, for sending those in. But we will have one-on-one interviews until about mid-November. With very, very engaging people. For example, this week, today, Kent Bai from the Voices of VR podcast. Kent Bai is an amazing podcaster. So this is a podcaster to podcaster interview, a meta conversation. Yes, Kent Bai interviewed and is interviewing everybody who has anything to say in the virtual reality space today, but we will not be talking about who he interviewed. We will have a meta conversation about media. I encourage everyone to subscribe to his podcast right away and also throw him a couple of bucks if you can to support him so that he can go to these conferences all over the world. He's a gifted journalist that has an important voice and is amassing an important archive. And let me just say, I know a lot of people from Second Life who listen to this podcast have expressed that they're not interested so much in goggles and HMDs, but I encourage those folks to listen today because we're all in a related field. We're all passionate about the user at the center of technology, making technology user centric, and that's what Kent and I will be addressing, and that's what hopefully virtual reality is at least partially about. Hopefully it's not just about how to watch Hulu with an HMD on. That's stuff that I'm also not really interested in. I'm interested in creating user-centric worlds and how they bring us closer together. And I know that that is Joe's emphasis as well. So as we mix news from Second Life and virtual reality, I hope that Second Life residents still remain engaged in this podcast. Without any further ado, here's Kent Bai describing a little bit what he does. Enjoy.
I have been since May of 2014. I've now done over 250 interviews with different VR developers, academics, kind of the pioneers and thought leaders in the VR space. And so I've been traveling around to different consumer virtual reality conferences as well as some academic conferences like the IEEE VR. And really, I really wanted to start to kind of document what was happening in the virtual reality space by talking to the creators, the people who are actually making it. And, I have ambitions to eventually start creating my own VR experiences. I've created some of my own through game jams and have a lot of ideas, but I just really get really excited about the potential of virtual reality. And so that's kind of my thing, is I really like to talk to the people and ask them kind of what they see as what they kind of see. What is the ultimate potential of virtual reality?
I forgot where you stated that. I think on your Patreon pitch that it's also an education for you. So when you talk to these people, they come from all these different backgrounds. They only have in common that they're enthusiastic about the possibilities of virtual reality. So you're absorbing all their knowledge while at the same time kind of spreading it out to the listener.
Yeah, it is possible to go to a university and to study virtual reality, but really the most innovative things that are happening are being done by the creators of people that are actually in the trenches creating these VR experiences with Oculus Rift DK2s and, all this other room scale Vive experiences that are out there. A lot of times it was funny when I went to the IEEE VR, I saw DK1s there. IEEE is kind of like the Institute of Electronic and Electrical Engineers. They have different branches. One of the branches is virtual reality. And so kind of like the biggest VR conference of the year is the IEEE VR, which is kind of the reason why I started into the podcast, is because right before the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference happened in May of 2014, there was the IEEE VR, which was a gathering all of the academics. It was happening in Wisconsin back in 2014, and there's literally no coverage of it from any of the consumer VR news outlets. And I was shocked. I was like, wow, here are these people that have been doing VR for 20 to 40 years, and yet it's almost like they're not even paying attention to what they're doing.
Just recently, maybe in the last year or year and a half, really, the consumer outlets have kind of emerged. I don't even know what was before there, Road to VR, Upload VR, and so on and so forth. The blogs, was there something that should have covered that conference?
I was in 2015. I actually went to the IEEE VR in France, and I was the only journalist there covering it.
So you're talking also about mainstream journalism.
They did have like a tour of like the mainstream press come in for like an hour and take a tour and take some video. But it's kind of like the local news kind of approach. No one that's really embedded tracking what's really happening. So there was about 500 people there, and I did interviews with about 10% of them. I did 55 interviews over the course of 5 days, and have been kind of slowly releasing those on the Voices of VR. And so from my perspective, and doing an interview with somebody from that academic community, they kind of talk about how there's this old VR and the new VR, and they really were these two distinct groups of the kind of academics that were involved with industry, since like really 1970. Henry Fuchs is somebody that I did an interview with. He's been doing it since 1970. And so just to go there and say, hey, what's been happening with VR since 1970? And to get that history of what's been happening, because a lot of people think about like the start of VR being of like the Kickstarter for Oculus Rift in 2012. And so the people that are coming into consumer VR sort of see this media narrative that is saying like, it started and failed in the 90s, and then now it's sort of like really taking off. But really it started back in 1968, and even before that, and then has been continuing to be happening in industries. And so there's a little bit of that shadow history that I wasn't hearing talked about, and I wanted to figure out, well, what was actually happening? So going to the people that have been doing VR since that time and really asking them to get a bit of that oral history. So I kind of see that that's part of my project of the Voices of VR, is to capture that oral history as VR is emerging, kind of what people are doing. It kind of feels like those days of the homebrew computer club where, the next Steve Jobs or Bill Gates is out there and they're making VR experiences. And I kind of see like, the Voices of VR, I want to be talking to those people. And so that when they look back, you're like, oh, wow, look at what he's doing now. This is what he was saying back in 2014, 2015, right when this was starting to really blow up.
This is amazing. I mean, you're really amassing an archive, and you're combating that amnesia, because as you're talking about this particular lack of historical context that people have, I mean, that's something that is, I think, pretty prevalent also in a lot of other fields, politics and so on and so forth. The listener is now thinking, oh, Draxter is going on his soapbox and starting again how the world is going to hell in a handbasket because we don't know what happened 10 years ago.
Just one example, going to the IEEE VR, there was sort of like Oculus had won this kind of like a technical achievement award, but it was a little bit of controversy because the way that the mainstream press had been covering Oculus was kind of like this story of like Palmer Luckey as a lone wolf in his parents' garage, creating this headset, and then John Carmack picking it up in E3, and that's kind of like that kind of erases the history of the impact of the academic community, because Palmer actually was working at the USC ICT with Mark Bolis.
And Jackie Maury is a good friend of mine, and she's probably listening right now, and she probably gets pretty mad whenever the press sort of frames the story in that garage context.
So it kind of erases the whole impact of all the 20 to 40 years worth of virtual reality. A lot of the stuff that had come about before the Oculus Kickstarter. So people have been doing the kind of using mobile phones as a VR headset. Kind of like a Google Cardboard-esque type of approach, even before the Oculus Rift. So there's stuff like that I think that story still hasn't been fully told. And I've talked to Palmer off the record, and he's essentially was like, the media is going to tell a narrative and a story, and it's a nice story, it's a great story, and part of that could have been pushed by the PR agencies to tell that story, and then so it's a little bit of like they know that there's more nuance to the story, but yet it's what gets out there, and it sounds great that there's this kind of whiz kid that comes on and does it all by himself. But really, he's standing on the shoulders of giants of all the stuff that's happened.
I feel often it is the journalists. It's a really lethal mix with these things. That the journalist is also under a certain amount of pressure to deliver it in a certain package, but there's also a time constraint. So then when you have a long conversation, it is so enticing for the journalist to boil it down and put it into the box of that garage myth. What you're doing is also something that a lot of other bloggers or podcasters do. I mean, we're having a meta conversation here. It's fascinating because you're filling that void that is really left wide open by whatever you want to call it, old media, established media, or whatever.
To me, when I actually did this whole documentary project that I never fully finished, but I was looking at the media leading up to the war in Iraq and looking how they kind of became an echo chamber. I went on this big mission of doing, if you look on my YouTube channel, I've got like 80 interviews with different journalists and think tank scholars and looking at how the media kind of failed. And there were some journalists that actually got the story, and those journalists who got the story from Knight Ridder, like Warren Strobel and Jonathan Landay, they told me, what they did was they didn't go to the press conferences where the Donald Rumsfeld of the Secretary of Defense was talking about this was the story. They were going to the people in the trenches who were on the front lines, and those were the people that were closest to the information, and they were the ones saying like, hey, there's something that's not adding up here from what we're seeing on boots on the ground versus what is being said at the top echelon. And so I kind of take that approach of like being able to talk to people on the periphery to be able to see what's actually happening rather than to going to the CEO of Oculus, because he's not the one who's going to be able to tell me the real story. I'm not necessarily as interested in talking to him. I'm more interested in talking to the engineers or the people who are actually kind of building it. And that's where you see, like, for me, the common thread of all the interviews that I've done, I think, is passion. Because people are passionate about this because they see the potential of it. They're able to take virtual reality, they put people in the headsets, and they see it, like, they see the impact of what they're able to create in their Unity or WebVR, or eventually, Second Life or other virtual worlds like High Fidelity. They're going to be able to see the impact of putting people in these immersive environments and what they're able to go do with that. And so with that, I'm like kind of capturing that vital passion that these and the kind of optimism of what they're working towards. And at the end of every interview, I ask people, what do you see as the ultimate potential of virtual reality? And I kind of see it as this litmus test. It's really interesting to see, like, either people have really thought about it, and they think about what they're doing as connected to that, or it's so overwhelming that they just can't even answer it.
I guess it's a given that all people are passionate about what they do, especially engineers. And what I often hear is about unleashing creativity. Now, I want to get your sense to this because there's two sides to this coin, and I find myself discussing virtual reality outside of sort of the bubble of the people who are in it, and I find myself talking to people who are very critical and afraid, quite frankly, of where we're headed. And there was a piece, and we have him on next podcast, Ruben Steiger, who was with Linden Lab and who then headed Millions of Us, which was a marketing firm that they did the Scion campaign and Second Life in 2006. So he was very, very big in that realm, marketing Second Life as a tool for products. and he put a piece out on Medium last week that was very critical of where we go with virtual reality. And incidentally, Steven Spielberg, who is doing Ready Player One, the movie, was quoted as saying that technology is disabling communication. I'm completely rephrasing him now, but he was basically saying, I summed it up in my Facebook post. Oh, Spielberg says the kids and their loud music these days. So my question to you is: people in that field will not tell you about, or will not say, there's a flip side, there's a possible dystopian future to it. I asked Philip Rosedale about that once, and he just said, yeah, people love dystopia, it's all exaggerated. But I think it's a valid point. I mean, how do you see this?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of valid questions in terms of like the sustainability of technology in this way, and is this going to be another way that we're just going to escape into dissociation, of disconnection from the earth and the environment? That's certainly a possibility. It's also a possibility that we could use the technology to make us draw the connections between how we're connected to these things. There's these VR experiences where you go through and you see these trees being cut down and have this like direct connection for, this paper is connected to these trees dying.
That's from the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab. Yeah, so it's a great example. Exactly. Yeah.
For me, I do think that there's this perception that virtual reality is isolating, and it can be. Especially if you are in a context where you're in a room and there's other people there and you're in VR, you're basically not engaged with them. However, I think that one of the things that people don't see is that there's the potential for like actually more authentic communication and connection within a virtual reality environment. And that's because you're able to, with hand tracking, communicate a lot of nonverbal body language that gets compressed and squashed in social media channels. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all these things where you're projecting out like a really filtered, compressed, a lot of context stripped out of just this story or myth of who you are, of your identity. And virtual reality is able to get back to the roots of like connecting and making it feel like you're in the same room, connecting to another person and being able to feel that subtle body language.
This is always when I explain Second Life to people, when they go, oh, Second Life is escapism. I said, no, it's about engaging in the way you want to kind of be perceived, and then engaging with a sense of presence and being in the moment.
So the thing that comes to mind is a couple of things. The first thing is that there's the toy box demo that a lot of the developers got their hands on for the first time at the Oculus Connect. And the toy box demo was kind of a real-time physics environment where you're in a virtual space with the Oculus Touch controller. So you have your hands in the game, and you're kind of a floating head with the hands. And the thing is that there's another person that's in there as well. Now, when they do the toy box demo, what they're doing is they're actually physically connecting the computers with a connection that allows them to do like real-time physics and high fidelity of audio. So that was part of the amazing thing, is that you're in this virtual environment with another person. So you're able to start to play and interact and engage with them with these different objects that are on the table. And you really get this sense of presence that is beyond anything I've ever experienced, because when you're with another person, you have this emotional connection, you have emotional presence, but you also have social presence. And so you start to, and what they did was have it kind of like a low fidelity, low poly environment, so that your expectations were that it didn't have to meet the standards that you would have if it was photorealistic. And so they're kind of in that sweet spot of creating that, the place illusion and plausibility illusion. You were in another place and everything you're doing seemed plausible. Because it seemed plausible, you have this extreme sense of presence with it. So to me, I think it kind of unlocked a lot of the potential, because we never had this sort of real-time physics environment with another person with that level of fidelity and that level of presence with the hand-tracked controllers, because you start to just really believe that you're there. And so given that, I think it opened up a lot of possibilities for where VR is going to be going. And as I went to the Oculus Connect, I had spent some time with friends, and they had this 4-year-old child, and they were really concerned about limiting the screen time for their child because they have TV shows and iPads, where if they wanted to have a break, they could just turn on the TV and the child would just go into this kind of altered state of being completely tuned into this. And so I can imagine a future where instead of having your child go and just tune out to the screen, perhaps they're going into a virtual environment with their relatives or their friends that are geographically not in the same city. But if they want to babysit or spend time playing and learning with their nephew or their grandson, then they'd be able to do that. And that would be so much more of an enriching, engaging experience for both people to be in a virtual environment with relatives. And to me, that's where I see this going, and is where instead of you're like tuned out into your phone, checked out, like where the environment that you're around, you may be going into VR and completely being isolated from what's happening around you, but you may actually be way more engaged in an interactive environment than you would be had you just been interacting with somebody on a 2D screen.
This is such an obvious thing that this technology will be way more engaging than, let's say, the television. And I gotta say this, I mean, I love my dad, and he's an engineer, and he's really up to speed with what's happening, but I don't know what happened. He was at dinner over here. Out of the blue, he says, "Do you guys not want to buy a television?" And I go, "No, why would?" Well, there's very interesting programs on there. And I know what he meant. And I said, well, there's three things. Number one, the interesting programs, whatever Frontline or whatever documentaries I watch, I can get them anywhere I want. I do not watch live sports. I can see that when you're a sports fan, you may need a TV.
Actually, I'd say that, we're actually entering like this golden age of storytelling with television. You look at stuff that like, the Game of Thrones, and, it's really optimized for being able to tell these, stories that are novel length. And if you look at the beginning of television with like, something like Dallas or
Knight Rider,
look at the narrative structure that they were doing and what they're able to do now, it's really like, it's a medium that virtual reality is not going to replace that level of storytelling.
So your point is that despite interactivity, a medium that lets you where you defer to a master storyteller is not going to be threatened by the advent of VR, the ubiquity.
I think that's a common mistake that a lot of people make, is that anytime a new communications medium comes up, they're like, oh, this is going to replace everything. Well, guess what? We still have radio. We still have books. We still have, all these mediums are out there. They have their strengths and weaknesses. And, that it takes time to develop the language of each of these mediums. And VR is at that point where it's so new that, just from historically, anytime there's a new communications medium, the tendency is to take what was happening in the previous medium and copy it over one-to-one for two reasons. The first reason is because that's just easy thing to do, and you're like experimenting, and you don't really know the language or the strengths and weaknesses for that medium yet. So you have to really start to replicate the previous mediums in that medium. Second of all, as an audience member, we don't know how to watch or really experience in this medium yet, right? And so there takes time. Like if you were to throw people like into like Memento or Game of Thrones back when TV, or they wouldn't be able to get it. They wouldn't be able to follow it. They needed this sort of like being able to start easy and slow. And so, you can't innovate too fast. You can't go to the ultimate potential of what this medium can go unless the audience is ready there to know how to really experience it. For example, in VR, there's this thing that happens when people put on a VR headset. They just sit and their heads are completely locked and they're look completely forward and they're not turning around. Because we've been trained that anytime there's a story, you just you look at the screen and you don't move your head. Now with VR, there's this thing of like, well, you can actually move your head around and look around, and you could also potentially engage and interact. And so you're starting to blend like these different mediums of like the storytelling that's been evolving in gaming and 2D screens. That's going to be evolving into virtual reality as well. And so it's kind of like this blend of storytelling that's taking really this mix of two things, which is agency and narrative. So the narrative storytelling that has been cultivated in all the other mediums and the lessons that we've learned from that, but also agency that we've gotten for being able to have direct control over where you're going, where you're looking, where you're going to go. And to me, the biggest confluence and lessons learned that we can take is from immersive theater. things like Sleep No More, where they have like a fixed geographic like location where there's a warehouse with 100 rooms. They have 21 actors who are running from room to room, and they're playing out Macbeth through interpretive dance. And so they are non-verbally communicating and running around. And as an audience member, you have this mask on, so you're anonymous, and you have to decide who are you going to follow. You don't know who anybody is because they're not speaking. You have to be familiar with Macbeth. And then, so essentially, instead of having one narrative thread, you have 21 narrative threads where each character becomes their own story. Not only that, but the location becomes its own story. So the location environment is also having like hidden clues that you could just pay attention to that and not even pay attention to any of these characters. But the idea is that each of the characters are running from room to room, and you have to decide who you're going to follow. You have to decide what story you're going to chase. And given that, you have to kind of piece together at the end, because there's 21 stories and it loops, so it happens like 2.5 times. You have a fragment of what happened, just very small puzzle pieces. So then you're forced to like be there with your friends and try to piece it together as to what happened. Or you go and see it over and over and over and over again. And so I think that's going to be the nature of VR, is that you're going to have these like looping narratives where there's going to be like this kind of like going to Burning Man, where there's so much stuff going on, it's impossible to experience it all. But what if it could all be captured, and you could like have a virtual Burning Man where you could go to it over and over and over again, and you could go see all the talks, or you could go to see that band and that DJ set, and you could even record yourself. So it's like you could start to like do time travel where you're like record your experience in this, and you record interactions and go back in time and look at it. So to me, the medium and the language of virtual reality is going to be something that is going to evolve over time. And it's going to take time, both from the creator standpoint, but also as an audience, because, you know, frankly, I kind of like try to do something like on the bleeding edge of the possibilities of doing kind of like a multi-threaded narrative. And you know, it took a lot of time for me just like explaining to people like, okay, this is how you should watch it. And then they get in there and they just sort of treat it like a TV show and they don't engage. And so it was just, yeah, this was a mobile VR jam experience that I created called Crossover, which, you know, we had kind of come up with the structure of it and inspired by Sleep No More, having like 3 rooms happening at once, and then there's a final scene, and so you kind of miss 2/3 of the narrative at the beginning, but at the end you kind of get the full story. So it was kind of like the idea that there would be, you know, 5 characters, 4 of which are dead, they're ghosts, and then by the end you know who's alive and who's dead, and then it's kind of a virtual grief ritual that is kind of exploring my own loss of my wife about a year ago in November, who died by suicide. So it was a story of trying to say all the things that were left unsaid and have a grief ritual around that. And her father had committed suicide, and so he was also in there, and we had lost a pregnancy, and so that story was in there. So it was really this story about loss and grief that I couldn't imagine telling in just a 2D screen. And the medium of virtual reality allowed me to have these intimate conversations where when you're in the VR experience, you feel like you're kind of like overhearing something that people are experiencing. And what I learned is that there is this power to narrative, that I can take my experience and kind of put it into the story. And it has a power of kind of getting to the essence of some deep emotions, like, you know, just like a song. You can listen to a song and there's a sort of a poetic nature where you listen to a lyric and it kind of captures, you know, exactly how you feel. And the song kind of captures the emotional tenor. The same thing with VR is that you can kind of like capture an experience that you had where sometimes you experience something and you get to the point where you're like, you know what, you just kind of had to be there. And with VR, you kind of are able to start to share those types of experiences that transcend needing to have the full context of being like embodied within another place. And something when you with the 2D, it kind of strips out a lot of that context, and sometimes it just doesn't translate.
But you hinted at that people who you showed this to didn't quite understand how to go about experiencing it. So you had to explain it. What did you mean, that they were more too passively experiencing it like a TV show, or?
So here's what happened is that, like, with Sleep No More, there's no dialogue, right? And so at any moment you could, if you get bored, you go and and they're running around. So like the characters, they're physically going into places where you can't follow them anymore. So they're forcing you to make a choice to stop following them. So the point is that, like, actually most people, when they watch Sleep No More, they kind of follow into the same thing. They find Macbeth, and there's like 50 or 100 people following Macbeth, right? And if you follow Macbeth through Sleep No More, he's the main character, and he's going to interact with all the other characters. But they did something that was really brilliant. They take Macbeth and they make it like, hey, you know what? You're not going to be able to follow him anymore. He's going to go to this like secret door, and you're done, right? And so then there's a big group of people that then have to disperse and kind of like find somebody else to follow. So the nature is to pick a narrative thread and to stick with it. And so in my experience, you have the opportunity any moment to eject and to go to another room. It's like if you were in a movie theater, and if you were bored, you just walk out and go see another movie. Like, how many people do that? Most people don't. They just stick through it. And so I was creating this narrative structure so there would be like moments where people could switch scenes. And what I found was a lot of people would just pick a room and stay there for the entire time, even though there was 2 other rooms that they could switch between. Now, people who are gamers and people who are into like interactive story, they would kind of play around, and they would be a little bit more engaged in that way. However, the weird thing is that if you did that, let's say that you were in the story and you were switching every 10 seconds, it'd actually be a really terrible experience because you wouldn't be able to get like any of that narrative. And so there's this balance between narrative and agency, and this is the dilemma, is because like you have a narrative and people want to stick with the narrative, but yet if you have agency, you're ejecting out of that narrative, and you're like giving them the freedom to be like, okay, if you want to just be the director of this and just sort of cut in the middle of this scene, which is kind of like just about to hit the climax, you might be thinking like, oh, no, like as a director or as a storyteller, you'd be like, we absolutely want them to see that. But with VR, it's kind of like, how do you tell stories that make more sense, or that it's a better experience if they actually move around? And so what I found is that actually if you exercise the limits of your agency, in my experience, it'd be a terrible experience. But I was counting on that, like, people would be able to make a choice, and they would just choose to happen into the perfect story. And if they, at the right moment, they would go to the other point, and they would see exactly what they needed to see. And at the end, it was kind of like everybody comes together, and that's the point where there was like no more choice. And then once they get that, then they can go back and kind of experience it. The first person that I ever showed it to watched it like it's a 10-minute experience, and she watched it 4 straight times because she got it. She was like, was confused. She understood more, and then she wanted to see every single storyline. And that was like, oh, this is perfect. Like, this is exactly what I'd imagine, that you would kind of like make a few limited choices, see the full scene, but then if you wanted to, go back and kind of see what you missed. And so I think there's going to be stories that really work for that, where at any moment you could eject and still be able to kind of piece things together, or it could be compelling enough that you want to go back and see it again, or maybe it's a social experience. And like I said, the Sleep No More is an experience that like is super optimized for that. It's something that I could go watch like 20 times because the amount of things they're doing with like, you could get, at some point, an actor could grab you and take you on an adventure and like and put you on a quest where they're like, go give this medallion to another person, and just to be able to capture the full story of that experience, I think is something that's super compelling, and people have seen it over and over and over again. And I think eventually virtual reality is going to get to that point.
In terms of virtual worlds, I mean, I encounter very often people who have enormous trouble with the amount of freedom that they offer. They feel overwhelmed. They wish somebody would be there to tell them what to do specifically right now. And there's a lot, you could go really deep philosophically how that kind of, where does that originate? That when a human being is given enormous amounts of freedom, why do they want to be sort of be actually put back in sort of lower hierarchy in terms of decision making. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, I'd say that lower hierarchy actually is optimized for story. And story can be a narrative that can be just as engaging and immersive. I mean, there's a power to story where stories are really the story of all of us trying to grow and evolve. And, like there's the hero's journey. It's like Joseph Campbell is kind of like taking story and kind of broken it down to its elements of like separation, ordeal, and return, where you're breaking away, you're kind of getting out of your rut, and then you're going through these challenges, and then you're learning. And so when we watch story, it's reflecting a part of ourselves, and the things that are the most striking of the story are kind of usually the things that are actually going on internally for what's happening in our own lives. And so there's a power that we could go into that passive state and be able to watch a story and be able to take us to an emotional place that we couldn't go had we had all that choice. Now, you're someone who has spent a lot of time in Second Life in these worlds where you're on the other end of the spectrum, where you're in the full and other extreme of agency of all these experiences you've been able to have by going to these worlds.
And you know what? And I boiled it down, and I realized what really appeals to me. It's like, and other people have expressed a similar thing, and that's what I want to ask you also. If hopefully virtual reality will broaden that. What appeals to me with Second Life and other Second Life enthusiasts is that it is like stepping into someone else's sort of dream world, and not necessarily with a sword and a list of monsters to kill, but just that dream world. And my son calls that stuff open world games, and since I'm an old guy, I didn't know what that means, but now I do. But a virtual world is more than an open world game in the sense that it's also user created. So it's the best of both worlds for the type of audience that is like me, where this stuff appeals. Exactly the antidote of a game with points and stuff like that. I mean, do open virtual worlds, high fidelity, Project Sensor from Linden Lab, and these types of worlds, and then by extension, game engines. I mean, game engines are free now. I mean, is there a market is there a market for a virtual world? If you want to classify virtual world as the opposite of a game, I guess. I don't actually know the definition. I think these definitions are kind of like, they're still kind of up for grabs in some sense, I guess.
Yeah, so I'd say definitely you look at all the science fiction, and they've been sort of talking about this metaverse idea, and from Snow Crash to Ready Player One, and I do think that a huge part of virtual reality is going to be these open world virtual worlds, and the ones that are going to be the winners are the ones that are going to be able to kind of have the most frictionless way for people to go in there and express their creativity. The easiest for them to go in there and then take an idea and then make it real in the virtual world.
Do people want to express their creativity, or do they just want to consume stuff? Do they just want to consume polished content and admire people in Hollywood who make big bucks making super polished stuff? Or can they also enjoy things that some dude around the block just made with a box of crayons?
I think that nature operates in like power law curves, and if you look at like the rule of like 20% of the people are going to be creating 80% of those experiences, and just the same like that other 80%. Like, for example, if you look at Wikipedia, how many contributors are there to Wikipedia versus how much traffic you get to Wikipedia? There's actually a very disproportionate amount of people that are actually creating that content versus how many people are going there to consume it. I think it's going to be that
guilty as charged. We could all participate, but what are we doing?
Yeah, how many Wikipedia pages have you edited?
I know, and I have a few things that I know that there could be. I could offer some really kind of niche expertise to some tiny little things, but I haven't done it. Damn it.
I think there's going to be people who are going to be more naturally inclined to be on that creative end, and other people that are more naturally inclined just to consume it. And so you need both. And it's never going to be 100% of the people contributing, I don't think. I think there's always going to be people who are consuming, because that's just not everybody's thing. Even on Twitter, people probably are on Twitter just consuming stuff, but they're not actually tweeting. So I think that you have these power law dynamics, I think, is an important thing to just kind of recognize that, this tends to happen where 20% of the people are taking 80% up of either the airspace of their talking in social situations or, companies and capitalism, like the 20% of them will be owning 80% of it's like the 99%, the occupied.
Remember the term prosumer that was thrown around? And I haven't heard anybody use that term for a couple of years now. But that's the world that I see also VR kind of possibly maybe making a reality once the tools are available and easy to use and all that and then maybe we can reform the school system in one fell swoop and everybody will create things, and I would think that will be a marvelous, beautiful, colorful world. And others say, no, dude, be careful what you wish for. It's going to be total chaos.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of VR experiences that are coming to mind. So the first one is Tilt Brush. And if you haven't experienced Tilt Brush, it's sort of like the Photoshop or Microsoft Paint of VR, where you're able to go in and start to paint in 3D spaces. And they have amazing light brushes that, never have I been able to kind of move my hand in a 3D space and then have it traced and be able to actually draw things and be able to see it. And then not only that, record it and see my whole creation kind of played back for me. And, at GDC was the first time that Tilt Brush was unveiled, and along with Job Simulator. So Job Simulator was like being able to be in VR and kind of like interact with some objects and be able to do anything with anything else. So you could pick up a piece of the meat and throw it at a robot, and it could hit them, and the robot would say, "Thank you, sir. May I have another?"
What kind of job is that? Is that when the robots take over the world and we don't have anything to do and automation is taking over, so we want to kind of simulate that we have jobs?
It's set in the 2049 when all computers and robots have taken over all the manual jobs. And so in order to experience what it was like to live in the 20th century, then you would go in the job simulator and chop up vegetables or be a bartender or but they found that actually doing two-handed interactions or a lot of those sort of menial jobs that may be replaced by automation, but they tend to still be really fun in a virtual environment because it gives you a sense of embodied presence to be able to kind of interact with things. So that sort of dynamic interaction with virtual worlds where everything's coherent. That's the plausibility illusion. So believing that this world is real and plausible, so that physics-based to be able to pick up stuff and throw them around, and it just makes it feel like you're actually there and doing things. So it's plausible, and the place illusion is just that you actually feel like you're in another place. So those are kind of like the foundation stones of presence, is that plausibility and that sense of presence. So that's Job Simulator. Now the Tilt Brush, and more recently Oculus Medium, and also the Fantastic Contraption. If you sort of start to hear, and I've done a lot of interviews with different developers, and these experiences tend to be near the top of the list of most people's, top 10 VR experiences.
What is the Fantastic Contraption?
So the Fantastic Contraption was this flash game that got kind of translated into VR. And the idea is that there's 3 or 4 different, let's say there's a bar and then there's a wheel, and you're just putting them together. It's kind of like a Tinker Toy where you can, or Legos, where you're just kind of building whatever you want to build. And, you could use your hands and put things together. You can lengthen bars. You can just, it's very simple, intuitive interface. But the goal is to just build a contraption that goes from point A to point B. And you can do all sorts of really crazy, wacky stuff, build catapults, and just really let your imagination run wild. And you can do all sorts of things to get from point A to point B. And so you're just trying to build this contraption in zero gravity. You hit go, it falls down, and if it works, it goes from point A to point B. If it doesn't, it'll just sort of crumble. So it's fun because you don't know what's going to happen when you hit go and if it's going to actually work or not. But the idea is that it's kind of like this open world construction where you're starting to take sort of very simple, limited numbers of building blocks and start building things in VR.
Linnet Lab was trying to do that. Just a reminder for the listeners, you may remember Creatorverse that under Rod Humble, when Rod Humble was at Linnet Lab, they put out a game for the iPad.
And so the other experience that just is worth mentioning that kind of gives you a taste of where this is going. Well, actually 2 more experiences. The first one is Oculus Medium. And And that's where it's more of a 3D sculpting. And so you're kind of drawing in volumetric shapes, kind of clay, and then you're shaping it. So you're creating 3D objects rather than like tilt brush, where you're kind of painting in 2D vector, and maybe you could create a 3D object, but it's not really a 3D object. And something like Oculus Medium is like you're actually sculpting 3D objects that could potentially eventually be exported and put into.
Right, you can print them too.
Print them, yeah. So it's really kind of like starting to get into this 3D user interface that you're actually creating, objects within VR, which is a world of difference with trying to create a 3D object within a 2D screen. For anybody that's tried to do that, that doesn't, it's not optimal. It's much better to be like in the space where you have a sense of scale and proportion, where you're in there and you're able to really like use your hands to create it. It was amazing. It was like both Tilt Brush and Oculus Medium to me are kind of like the applications that are starting to unlock our creative potential within VR, and we're able to do frictionless creation, just like in Fantastic Contraption. It's like reducing the friction out of building stuff. It's just like super easy and fast and super compelling. And the other experience, of course, is Minecraft, where a lot of people are using this sort of 2D interface to kind of create these crazy, wild, like architecture and buildings. And
okay, sorry to cut you off, and I know I have to say this tongue in cheek, but whenever somebody, and I have nothing against Minecraft, but whenever people say about Minecraft amazing, any Second Lifer will go like, okay, what's the big deal?
What I would say is it's an uncanny valley issue. If you have to understand the high fidelity and low fidelity in a certain way, and it's a game. It's fun. I haven't actually spent a lot of time either in Minecraft or in Second Life to be able to do a direct, but I just know from seeing it that it's a frictionless way of people creating things, and it's a game. There's a game element to it that is more gamified, and so and it's easy for people to do. It's amazing what people can create, and so you have to look at it in terms of, even if people from Second Life poo-poo it, you have to see it as a cultural phenomenon.
And I don't want to deny that, and a lot has to do with being at the right time, the right place at the right time, the distribution and multipliers and so on and so forth. That's an interesting point with Uncanny Valley. I would argue, and we're not going to bore the listeners with this continuous argument, because it comes across as defensive. I think it's great. It's a success that is well deserved with Minecraft. In Second Life, you have a lot more complexity and a lot more possibilities, and these possibilities can, and that's the flip side of it, can be completely overwhelming when people go in. On the other hand, the way people can express themselves in their avatars, in how they feel inside, how they can express that is at a much higher, more detailed level.
It is higher. It is. I would say it's higher fidelity. You have a higher fidelity, and with that higher fidelity, you have more of an ability to have a more dynamic range of expression of identity.
My question is, with all this new stuff, what do you think is the importance of the avatar? That the avatar is an expression of yourself, and then the customization of that avatar. How important is that? To me personally, it's hugely important. Everybody that I profiled so far in the video series, that's the first thing they say. The avatar is me. It's my inner self. I can create that person. That's how I see myself inside. When I look in the mirror, I see my avatar basically. And with all this new stuff, and you made a good point earlier with Toybox, is that obviously intentionally the developers at Oculus have created these shadowy ghost-like figures that are not identifiable. But going forward, what do you think? How important is the avatar? Is the avatar a thing of the past? Will we just kind of plug into these experiences and then we're this guy for 5 minutes or this other guy and that's it?
I think avatars are going to be huge because it is an expression of identity. And I think that if you can kind of think of a lot of Second Life as an externalized expression of identity, in some ways, like whatever you're creating is an expression of yourself. And I think that's going to hold true also in VR as well. Is like there's going to be all sorts of ways, just like let's say like a MySpace page or Friendster page or less so Facebook, but when you are able to really customize the look and feel of your identity online, let's say like MySpace would be like the extreme of that. And I feel like there's going to be like rooms that you have like in Ready Player One where you're like, this is my virtual living room where we're going to hang out and chat, and it's going to be sort of all of the things that are going to be in the room are going to be an expression of your identity. And I think the avatar, it's an interesting point in terms of like, is it going to be a first person or third person's perspective of the avatar? Because once you're in a first person perspective, then it's going to be actually harder to see what your avatar fully looks like unless you're looking in a mirror. And it's going to be more about how people are kind of like reacting to you. But it's still going to be that expression. If it's a third person, you're going to actually be able to see your avatar, and you may have like a different connection to it. I know in Second Life, you can kind of like switch between that first and third person.
I got to say, the first time I experienced Second Life with Oculus, it was incredibly crazy, amazing when I was in third person. It wasn't even that big of a deal in first person, which was cool. I'm doing a story right now where a lot of Oculus stuff is featured. It's coming in November, and I think people will be quite amazed what is still possible in Second Life with Oculus. It works really well. But long story short, when I saw myself in third person and I was hovering over my avatar, it was amazing. It was like, wow, I am God, but this is also me. This is Jesus. He's my son. He's walking on earth. It was really that kind of feeling because I had that strong sense of who I was, and that was the first. I spent the first 30 minutes with Oculus in Second Life just examining my avatar, like, whoa, dude, the abs. Have you been working out? I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, this gets to the issue of virtual reality and locomotion sickness, VR sickness, simulation sickness. Because when you walk around in VR, a lot of people get sick. I mean, some people don't, but most people don't, because there's this disconnect between what your body's experiencing and what your perceptual, vestibular system is all experiencing as well. So third-person perspective actually is an approach that some people have been using to help minimize that motion sickness, because you have a fixed object in your scene that you can focus on. And things like Luckey's tail, you can kind of move around in this third-person perspective, and it's kind of like an interesting kind of like unintuitive insight as to like everybody thought that everything was going to be in first person, but perhaps when you're moving around and locomoting, in VR, it'll be in a third-person perspective, or if it's first-person perspective, maybe everybody's teleporting around. That's sort of a separate issue that's still unresolved, but the simulator sickness issue is a huge one, and it's going to kind of be determining whether or not it's going to be first or third-person perspective. But one thing I think about the avatars is that, if you kind of think of it as a spiritual perspective, like if you believe in the concept of souls, you could say that our soul is in this body, and this body is kind of like a virtual avatar of our soul. And that when you go into these virtual experiences, you could think of it as a way as like getting closer to your soul essence. In a lot of ways, we don't have a lot of choices in terms of what our physical avatar looks like. I mean, sure, we can dress in a certain way, we could do plastic surgery, but at some point, there's going to be a limit in terms of what your genetics and what you're dealt with. And so in virtual worlds, you don't have those limitations. You can have whatever type of expression you want. And I think that a lot of ways, and I'm sure you could testify this as well, a lot of people have talked to, is that being able to create this avatar, it could actually get you closer to your soul essence of what you actually identify with.
I see a huge opportunity also for a company to create an avatar, avatar creation tool that is compatible with all sorts of other experiences in VR. Because when we're talking about now, I am creating this digital alter ego that is my traveler that I'm sending off to these worlds. Ideally, well, I personally, for sure, I want to be in that same body. I may want to wear a different shirt and hat, but I essentially want to be the same person.
Yeah. So right now there's like, certain 3D models that can be put in, like there is some standard to be able to take one avatar and kind of put it in different places. And I think that it'll be really interesting to see how all this plays out, because it's really still early days. But I will say that the kind of leading approach that I've seen has been high fidelity. I don't know what Linden Labs' approach is going to be in terms of like taking an open source approach, but High Fidelity and Philip Rosedale, they're taking an approach where they're like, hey, let's treat this like the internet. Let's create a web stack so that you could host your own server, and let's create the metaverse kind of like using the principles of the internet. The internet works. It's been great. And he kind of compared it to like the AOL CompuServe walled garden approach, which was like, hey, let's have like all of our proprietary sort of stack. And then, it's like this being able to link between the different worlds is going to be a key thing.
As the same person and experience whatever it is, and you have the same memories with the same person. Just want to throw that out. Mixamo obviously was acquired by Adobe, and my high fidelity avatar was mainly from Second Life created in a Mixamo, and it's an incredible tool, actually, really simple to use, and it's basically then you drop it into high fidelity, and there you go. So I guess maybe Adobe is trying to get on the VR bandwagon, maybe establishing themselves as the number one avatar creation. Who knows?
In terms of the future of the metaverse, right now, doing a virtual reality experience directly mediated through the web browser is not as ideal as it being mediated through kind of a native application that's running something like Unity.
Tony Parisi would disagree with that.
The web developers who are actually doing it, I think, would agree, because there's still a lot of architecture that has to happen in Chrome and Mozilla. What they would say is that it's getting there. It's not there yet. If you were to compare them side by side, and I think Tony would actually agree with me saying that here, is that like right now at this moment, in terms of performance and frame rate, like a native web app is going to be way better than what the web browser can do. That may change, and that is changing, and they're re-architecting to be able to get there. But there is this disconnect right now, which means that anybody that wants to create a really solid VR experience has to use it on a PC, kind of wrapped in this native kind of code. Eventually, the web is going to be able to get there. I do think that it will get there with WebVR, and they have to sort of make these browsers into real-time browsers, which is happening. So once that happens, though, then we'll be able to kind of like have these VR experiences directly mediated through our web browsers, and that to me is, I think I get excited about like the potential of the open source approach of high fidelity, because I want to see an open world. I don't want to see like a fractured iPhone app kind of, like you have to install an application. And I don't think that's not going to fly when it comes to that.
Well, with high fidelity, you have a client as well. And Linden Lab is saying, Ebbe Altberg keeps saying that Project Sensor will be the WordPress of virtual worlds. So it might be proprietary, but it nonetheless, they're both aiming for, I guess, dominance in the market.
Yeah, and will you be able to link from one of the worlds to the other? That'll be the question. It will, and that sort of gets to like, is there going to be some sort of like open standard that is going to allow portals or doorways to be able to go from one world to the other? So,
Deja vu. In 2008, IBM and Linden Lab were collaborating, teleporting from OpenSim to Second Life. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead. It's deja vu for us old people. You're the young kids in their VR.
Well, what I would say is that my prediction would be the ones that's going to be the one that really takes off are the ones that are going to make it the easiest, most frictionless way to take your idea that you have and being able to create that in the world. Like that's going to be those creation tools, and I think that's probably why Linden Lab honestly was like they needed to just start from scratch and redesign it to make it easier to be performant, to be able to be built for VR, because they kind of see the writing on the wall that these immersive worlds are the future, and they're actually in a really good position because of all of the experience they have in managing these virtual worlds to make a huge impact. So it's just whether or not they're going to be able to be open, whether or not the creation tools are going to be easy and intuitive, and whether or not they're going to get sort of buy-in from other early movers in this space.
My last question, because I worked in radio. Actually, this is the penultimate question. I worked in radio. And when I quit, it was a good feeling when I went indie, so to speak. But I missed that rush. Your podcast is daily, which is insane. How do you survive? But you must have a very good workflow. This is very smart. You go to a conference, you come home with 50, 60 different people.
So yeah, I do go to different conferences and get anywhere from 20 to 50 interviews, and I do 5 a week every weekday. So that's that could be 10 weeks worth of stuff. But I did quit my job, and I do have a Patreon, and I'm kind of in that nebulous space where it's not sustainable. I'm trying to get. If people are listeners, I would encourage them to please become a contributor of the Patreon to allow me to continue this, because I'm really passionate about it. And
please, listener, do that. Please support Ken. It's a really, really great podcast. And if you only have Linden dollars to spare, maybe Ken can just sign up an avatar so you can just drop those Linden dollars into Ken's account and he can cash them out through PayPal.
Okay. Well, so I do, and I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to get a sponsor. I'm in this phase where I do eventually want to create VR as well. It does take a lot of energy. Each episode takes anywhere from 4 to 5 hours on average to produce and make. And for the first year I was doing it, I had a full-time job. And so it was pretty insane getting up at 5 a.m. But it's just something that at some point I was like, you know what, I'm just going to make this a daily thing. Get the insights of what are they learning? What are they seeing? What are they excited about? Where do they see this going? And, it's pretty dominated right now with gamers, because the gamers are the ones who have the technical competence and the ability to work with the tools. They have the ability with all the promotion and the Steam, and it's just like a whole ecosystem that can support independent game developers to create this. And so there's a business model there that, they could sort of become the next indie hit, like Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. That's really kind of exploding right now. So like there's this indie dream of being able to be that one hit that, is being able to define the language of virtual reality. So yeah, for me, I also want to create VR experiences, but I also want to listen to all these people that are going beyond just gaming and looking at the non-gaming applications, because there's a lot of gaming journalism, a lot of gaming stuff that's out there. And so I think eventually the Voices of VR will probably be a lot more balanced of these non-gaming applications and start to really hear what people are doing. And to me, that's a lot of the really interesting, innovative stuff of like, oh, there's people that are using VR to like completely revolutionize the architecture industry, or to cure their lazy eye, or to be able to rewire their brains through neuroplasticity, or to stroke rehabilitation, or, all these different ways that people are using VR that sort of goes beyond sort of just entertainment.
This is my final question, because earlier you talked about loss. I experienced loss in my family, and I often think that what I really would love to see, and this is a question of where we're going in the long run, and will that be possible, and will we do it if it's possible? I imagine a future, and I imagine it positively, where I can recreate family members that passed away, and I can feed them information that I have. I have lots of tapes. I would basically create AI characters to surround myself in a virtual reality experience, to connect myself and then maybe my children and my grandchildren with the past, and the past comes alive.
I think the virtual reality is going to be less of being able to throw a bunch of raw data at it and be able to kind of magically recreate the soul of your ancestors. It's going to be less about that, I think. That's sort of like maybe 50, 100 years from now. Virtual reality is going to be more about like hitting the record button and being able to capture an experience that you had and be able to replay it. So one experiment that was from Mel Slater, he had this sort of moral dilemma where he's putting people and they're like deciding whether or not to put people on the different levels of an elevator, and then this seventh guy comes in and shoots everybody, and then they come back a week later and they are able to watch what they did a week previous. And as they're watching it, they get this feeling of time travel. They have this time travel illusion because they have this body was being tracked, and they have this virtual body ownership illusion. So being able to have a virtual body ownership illusion within VR means that you have this sense of embodied presence that is stored as a memory of like that you actually identify with your avatar as your avatar. And so being able to record that is kind of changing what it means to have memories. So being able to take these experiences, so what's that mean to be able to share an experience with, your children, that maybe you recorded a conversation or an activity with, your parents, and then when they die, then they're able to maybe go back and your children can kind of objectively watch this experience that unfolded. And then maybe that'll give them a sense of who they were. So just like you could record somebody, and watch a video of them, I think in VR, they're going to eventually be able to be in these virtual spaces, having these social interactions that are going to be recordable, and then you're going to be able to go back and kind of experience them later. And so there's going to be a change of what that does to our memory, because you're going to actually literally be able to go back and visit conversations and memories that we have forgotten, but also be able to share those. And so I think that it's going to kind of change the way that what we see as a real, or what we see as these important moments. So how do you capture hanging out with somebody for a full day? How do you extract that to the core essence of just a few moments? It's just like if you were to run around videotaping everything, nobody want to watch 8 hours of a video like that. And so if you look at the Gutenberg press, that was a thing that was able to produce books in a way that went beyond just the Bible, and they had to kind of create the novel and to be able to fill the words within these books. But eventually, books have gotten to this point where you're able to really capture knowledge and information. Books are so good at being able to okay, if you want to know something, go read this book about it, and you be able to kind of get up to speed for the knowledge that you need to be able to translate that into your wisdom and actual, from information into knowledge that's inside your body. And so books can capture knowledge and information. VR can capture human experience in a way that goes beyond any other 2D medium. You're able to create this sense of embodied presence that tricks your subconscious mind into believing that you're in this reality and in this world. And just as books were able to spur this renaissance, I think virtual reality is going to spur this other renaissance of these immersive technologies of sharing experiences, whether it's through education, changing revolutionary education, medicine, architecture. And ultimately, I think that it's going to unleash our creativity in a way that things like Second Life and the new Project Sensei and the high fidelity, the Metaverse, the vision of the Metaverse that sci-fi fiction writers have been writing about and thinking about forever. And it's not just about it's about the social interactions. And so the thing that's going to make it key, and the thing that's going to make it really take off, is that if you can go into VR and come out being more human. And part of that is that you go into these experiences, you have social interactions, and it has the potential to really express our full nonverbal communications, have a wider dynamic range of emotions. Grief, sadness is something that is often filtered out of social media because it's not happy. It's not something that you really want to give a thumbs up to. And so people tend to filter out all the negative, bad things that are happening. But there's something about these immersive technologies that are able to kind of restore our humanity to be able to have this full dynamic range of emotion that we can explore stories that are about grief, explore stories that are about, building empathy about the experience of another person. And I think that, to me, there's a lot of untold stories, untold human elements of human experience that we haven't been able to really express yet because of the limitations of the previous mediums.
I was telling my friend from high school last week, it was a phone conversation about Noni de la Peña's project Syria, because she started with talking, kids are addicted to screens and they feel a lot of peer pressure. And I didn't diminish it in the conversation with her, that issue. That is a serious issue. That there's a certain pressure in social media to like, and why didn't you like this? Why didn't you respond to this tweet? And blah blah blah. Why didn't you favorite it? That kind of peer pressure that we had in school is manifold now because of all these different media. And she was talking about that, and then I said, you know what? Exactly what you said, the range of human experiences, blah blah blah. Noni de la Peña, Project Syria. You are in a Syrian refugee camp, and you're also the bomb explodes, and so on and so forth. And you're right there, and it's the immediacy hopefully creates empathy more than maybe a news report that you're watching, and then you turn off the TV, and then you're watching a baseball game right after. But she said, well, that would be just sort of. She didn't use the term disaster porn, but I guess that's what she meant to say, that we're then also just sort of gleefully gleeful spectators, like rubbernecking when an accident happens or whatever. And I think that this is something that you cannot explain. This is, again, something you need to put the thing on, the H&D, and you got to be in it.
I would say that Mad Max Fury Road, it's the extreme essence of what you can do with visual storytelling in a 2D medium. And, I'm a big believer that there's something about like seeing something in a 2D screen. There's a certain objectified distance that you have. You get desensitized to violence. And that when you're immersed into an environment, you are not having that same level of disassociation. You're immersed in it, and so you feel like you're there. And so if you take a film like Mad Max Fury Road, first of all, the visual storytelling of like having a cut every 2 seconds, it's just like you wouldn't be able to tell that story in the same way in VR because you wouldn't be able to like switch your entire environment that quickly. And so film, 2D screens, you're able to like very fast cut between and really tell a story in that way. And there's also a level of violence that's in that film that if you had in a VR experience, I think that eventually what we're going to see is that we're going to see a lot of stuff like shooting zombies in the face. Zombies aren't real. People know that zombies aren't real. It'll be okay. People want to do it. That's like their fantasy. But yet, I was in an experience with the Sony Morpheus where I had my hands in the game. It was called the London Heist. And I'm doing this cover shooter and I'm like, going out and I shoot a guy. And I have this thought like, oh my God, it was the first time I ever shot a person in VR. There's blood everywhere. I was a pause. And this pause where I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that there's a part of myself that said this is wrong. And I didn't want, and I knew that it was a game. It wasn't real. And I had to tell myself, Kent, this isn't real. You need to finish this experience because you need to really test the limits of this VR technology, But it made me think like, people aren't going to want to go around like GTA, Grand Theft Auto, just killing random people because it's a different experience when you do it in VR because it feels a lot more real. And, unless you are just completely sociopathic or disassociated from your body or heart, people are going to be able to do that. They're going to do that. I'm sure those experiences are going to exist, where you can go, do a massacre, but it's not going to be an enjoyable experience and people aren't going to be drawn to it. It's going to be more about receiving the environments. It's going to be more about taking it in. It's about going slow. It's not going to be about like running around really fast and just. So a lot of the experiences are less about like going on this hero's journey where you're running around all over the place. And it's going to be more about like going inward and exploring a space and really meditating and being contemplative and kind of like these mist-like adventures where you're able to really like fully explore a space, a room. Every object has a story. Those types of things where there's going to be a new level of storytelling that's less about you going on an adventure and more about you kind of exploring a physical space and your kind of inner dynamics.
You're making an incredibly good point. This is a great point to end. If, in fact, the lack of distance that VR affords will lead us to reverse the desensitization to violence process, that will be a huge winner for humanity. On that note, thank you for speaking with us, and I'll hope you're back on the show sometime.
Thanks a lot, Drax.
And that was Kent Bai. He mentioned the Sleep No More Immersive Theater. He mentioned his Patreon page, a lot of stuff, and we link to that stuff on the blog page. Also, Ruben Steiger was mentioned, and he will be on next week. Fascinating conversation about his critical article of the flip side of actually disengaging because of technology. I am working on getting Sherry Turkle on from MIT, who was also a supporter of virtual worlds, I guess, and then changed to an important critical voice with her book Alone Together, where she criticizes the fact that modern technology, especially toys for children, disengage kids from the one-on-one conversation. So she has a nuanced view on it. I'm working on getting her on the podcast. But in the meantime, have a fabulous weekend. We will be filming Drax Files episode 33 this weekend. If you see me in world, I am me. If I don't get back to you, I'm filming. But if you want to be in the scene, if you want to play an extra, we're going to shoot a whole bunch of action sequences. They're going to be great fun. Just I am me, and I'll teleport you in if we need some more folks. That's it. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
The Drax Files Radio Hour with Joe Yardley is a weekly production of Basic Drax Entertainment. The show is supported by Maven Homes, Giza Creations, Botanical, Strawberry Sing, Abranimations, Arrows Avatars, Caravel Design, Humanoid Animations, Avacon, The Cube Republic, Fateware by Damien Fate, The Avazines Publication Family, What Next, Bright Canopy, Duchy Furniture, Landscapes Unlimited, Dwarfins, The Den, Following Gods Incorporated, Feroce SL, Kona Stream, and Death Row Designs. Contact the show via Skype, Drax Files, Avatar Drax Files, or email radio@draxfiles.com.